Dilemma Podcast, Jay Shapiro here. Quick announcement up front. I'm going to try something here on YouTube. I've been seeing some people giving me super thanks and putting some money in the tip jar in that way, and I really, really appreciate that. Obviously, these things take a while to produce, and I love really doing them. But I want to try to figure out a better way to kind of connect with everyone who's doing that rather than just the comment section. So I'm going to try this here on YouTube of just a little membership program, a couple bucks a month to support me and the work I'm doing here and the time it takes to do these things, which is hugely appreciated. And then in return, or maybe whatever, I feel weird about even saying that, I want to try to do once a month a live stream just for the members where we can talk, we could chat, you could ask me questions, we could talk about what books we're reading, you could tell me how awful you think I'm doing in some of the interviews or suggest different guests for me or that kind of stuff, and just share ideas for an hour or two. And I want to do it once a month on the last Sunday of every month. So look for that membership just here on YouTube to help me out and do what we're doing and to help support me in the show. So I guess that first one would be September 28th, but sign up for this membership program just here on YouTube. And then as a special offer for my Zionist fan club, I'm offering them a membership class at $1,000 a month where you get to yell at me for 5 minutes. I'm just kidding. In fact, I'm reading a lot of the comments, even some of the sort of hateful ones, but there are some good criticisms in there, and I'm even getting some emails that are good. I am taking a lot of that into account and intend to address those things in future essays. And so anyway, even if you hate me or want to criticize me, maybe we could, in that room, talk about, ways I could improve. We'll put it that way. But yeah, look for that membership to Dilemma Podcast. It'd be awesome to connect with you people out there on a more personal level and get our brains together and share what we can share out in the world.
We need to see the question of Palestine and the genocide in Gaza as very much related to these dynamics around the climate and our fossil fuel-centered world. This year, or last year when we have the latest figures, was the largest consumption of coal and gas and oil in human history. The global financial architecture which we live in today, which is a US dollar-centered financial architecture, dominated by Anglo-American banks through like the City of London, through New York, etc., really is bound up with where these petrodollars went in the 70s.
Quickly off the top, I had a really awesome conversation with the guys over at the Bet Beat Media podcast that is live now. I can link to it in the description, which really goes into much more of my thinking on Gaza and Zionism and my upbringing on Israel-Palestine stuff. But I thought that one was really, really great. But now I want to shift to this one, which is a conversation with Adam Hanieh, who's an awesome thinker and writer who analyzes the world through the lens of petrochemicals, with an emphasis on petrochemicals, in particular the Gulf states and how it affects the geopolitics there. His book, Crude Capitalism, is out in hardback, but it's coming out in paperback in just about a week or so or two. I'll put a link also in the description. So you can pre-order that now or buy it when it's out in paperback, or just buy the hardcover, of course. He's really amazing. I loved this conversation, and I want to try to prompt it with two sort of pre-thoughts here to get you thinking in this way. So I've tried to do this before. I used ChatGPT to help me with some of this math, but I think this works. So I want to try to prompt what I think is an interesting way to think about just how important oil was and is as an advance of sort of task-focused efficiency of human behavior. And what that means. It was kind of inspired by something that Václav Smil did in this book, Energy and Civilization: A History, which is a fascinating book with a ton of math about all kinds of ways that energy in so many ways is the thing to talk about how civilization moves forward. So here's the thought experiment. Imagine you're a farmer and you have 1,000 rows of corn. And you're going to have people come to you one by one. You need to harvest this corn or shuck it or whatever they do. I'm not a farmer. Turn it in from this state into this state. And people are going to come to you one by one with different kinds of technology to assist them in this job. And this math sort of works out. So one guy comes in, he has no technology, just has muscles. And he is a strong guy, and he looks at it and he says, I could probably do 1 row a day, which must be long rows. And my price is $10 an hour. Just assume that $10 an hour is a fair sort of midpoint market price in the community you're in, and what he could buy with that $10 correlates with some sort of midpoint of fairness. And so there you go. His quote is, it'll take me 1,000 days and it'll cost $10,000 because my price is $10 a day. Just, 1,000 days of the corn would probably go bad. It's a thought experiment. Just go with it. So that's the first quote. Next guy comes along and he says, I invented something. It's wheelbarrow. It's got this wheel and this thing, and it helps me sort of save some of my energy because I shuck it and put it in there. I don't have to carry it on my back as much. So actually I could do a little more. My estimate is I could do 1.23 rows per day of this. So I could do it in about 813 days, $8,130. That's my price. A little advanced, right? Another guy comes along and he's got some better, sharper tools that helps him, remove the ears of corn quicker, whatever it is. And, he's developed some steel techniques to do this. And his estimate is he can do better. He says, I can do 1.78 rows per day. So that's now about 562 days, and $5,620 is there. We're almost half the original price. Another guy comes along and he's got an animal-drawn cart. He's like, this animal's really strong. It saved me a ton of labor, so I could do this even quicker. I could probably do more. And I could do almost, 1.9 rows per day. So now we're down to 526 days at about $5,260. Then a big advance comes along, which happened at a certain point, and it was a steam engine. He's like, I've got this steam-powered reaper and binder, which does some of the work, and this machine is doing more of the work. It's a little more automated, runs on steam power. And he's like, I could do actually about 4.7 rows per day. Big jump there, right? So I could do the whole thing in about 214 days. $2,140 is my price. And then this guy comes along and says, I found this stuff in the ground. And it's called oil, and it's super energy efficient, and it's really easy to get out of the ground. And I made this combustion engine, and I can really blow this out of the water. I've looked at this, and I can actually do about 100 rows per day, 80 to 100 rows per day with this machine. So now his estimate is I could do it in under 13 days, pay me $130, and your job is done. That's about the way the math works out with oil compared to when we were starting with, the zero technology, just human labor. In other words, a gallon of oil, say that runs it for a day, is worth about 23 human workdays of labor. So that, and of course we could go even better with a nuclear powered thing or whatever it is going forward to maybe get this to zero or free. But that advance in oil, just as an energy-rich liquid fuel, and Adam Hanieh is going to point out that that's only one usage, I think a huge usage, and he agrees, but oil is everywhere, right? The synthetic fibers of this shirt and this pen and the camera I'm shooting, these are oil products, right? The rubber on the road, these are oil products. And so oil, the age of oil, is a much bigger story than just that liquid fuel. But as a way to prompt your thinking of, this is, a world-changing, empire-changing, power-changing source of energy, of an energy-dense thing, that it really, of course, changed the world. And then another thing so that's the first thing. The other thing I want to sort of prompt your intuition on is a few years ago I had to ship some furniture that was going on a boat. And so I went to a website for the first time to track this ship. It was like vesselfinder.com. And I was blown away. I think sometimes it's easy to think or forget that we live in still a very analog world, right? You're watching this on YouTube and it feels very magical sometimes with texting and AI and all these things. But actually, a lot of it is like pipes in the ground and ships going through straits. Because a lot of this conversation you're going to hear with Adam Hanieh, I want you to have geography in your mind as well of these things. So this is what Vessel Finder looks like right now. I'm going to click on it live right now. And you can see this is the shape of the world. It's a kind of a cool site. You could click on things and see what's what. Of course, there's the Strait of Hormuz, which is the choke point with Iran up there. If you're going to get the oil from the fields of Kuwait and Iraq or this part of Saudi Arabia, you're going to be going around this. You've got the the Bab al-Mandab, of course, which is the choke point around Yemen, where the Houthis are trying to exert some of their control. Because if that's closed and you're trying to get from these very oil-rich areas, say up in Iran or Saudi Arabia, you're either going this way or you're going around the whole thing around Africa, which of course makes it a lot more expensive and takes a lot longer. And then, of course, up with the Sinai, you have the Strait of Tiran, which is what this little entry into the port of Eilat that Israel has to get the oil or whatever they're trying to ship in and out of this spot. Jordan has a little piece of that too. That's the strait that Egypt was cutting off in 1967, which led to the 1967 Six-Day War. We all know that story. And then, of course, on the other side, the Suez Canal, which Egypt also, had long fights over with Britain to close it off. And you could see what goes through there all the time. So I think in some ways it's just like eye-opening to see that, that's the world we live in. And so this lens of analysis that Adam Hanieh offers of resources and oil and the intertwining of geopolitics in this process, I think you cannot overstate how important a factor this is, right? So if you see something like what's happening in Gaza or the West Bank and someone's like, it's not about oil, there's no oil in Gaza or whatever, it's just such a massive misunderstanding of geopolitics and the way that these relationships work and who's working in what region to do what kind of thing and keep certain alliances alive. I mean, you have to understand this thing in a much more regional and global intertwined way, I think. And so obviously I've had a lot of strained conversations about Israel and Palestine lately. You've witnessed some of them, but some of them, like with Scott Horton, I feel like I've been unsuccessful putting this point on the table, or some of the more libertarian right, Candace Owens, Dave Smith, et cetera, whoever they are, who I share and appreciate their massive moral outrage on what's happening in Gaza. But the one piece where they emphasize sort of like what is Israel's interests have nothing to do with American interests is the one point that I always am sort of like, I think they're more intertwined than you think. And again, that is not at all a moral argument to continue those immoral actions and relationships. It just points to, I think, a bigger mess of an intertwined economic, political problem with something like that it is so intertwined. And so I think this lens that Adam Hanieh is going to help walk us through, it's just necessary to add to this conversation. And so enjoy Adam Hanieh. I'll be back at the end with just a really quick afterthought, but enjoy my conversation with Adam Hanieh. I loved it. You will too. How do you like to introduce yourself? Because, sort of where you're from and then how you got interested in these big questions.
I was born in Jordan, Palestinian background, but grew up in Australia. And I lived and worked in Palestine through the late 1990s, early 2000s, during the period of the Second Intifada in particular.
In the West Bank. Yeah.
Yes, in the West Bank, in Ramallah. And, in that time, living and working was really kind of a formative experience for me in the West Bank, getting to know what was going on over there in kind of granular detail, especially during the experience of the Second Intifada, which, I think bears a lot on how we understand actually the politics of the region today. Because that was the period that followed immediately the Oslo Accord of the 1990s.
Yeah. And then while just on your background of how you got into these questions, in particular, sort of an interest in petrochemicals, this is always kind of hard for us to do, but do you think it was motivated by a desire for justice and freedom of the Palestinian cause or anything like that, or just a way to sort of make sense of a lot of chaos you were seeing in the world? Can you psychoanalyze yourself in any way there?
Well, I think one of the things that is very clear, spending any time in the Middle East is the outsized role of the Gulf states in the politics, the economics, the social dynamics of the region. You can see very clearly in the case of Palestine, for example, so many people have spent time working in the Gulf and sending home remittances back to families. You can see At the political level, the way that the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, but also the UAE, United Arab Emirates, really play a major role in the kind of political decisions, the nature of the PLO, and also the Palestinian Authority today. And then economically, it's very clear the ways in which the economic power of the Gulf has really increased over the last couple of decades. So I think being exposed and seeing those dynamics firsthand really motivated me, I think, to kind of understand the questions of Palestine, not simply through the lens of what's going on in the borders of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, or in Palestine more broadly, but actually in the regional context. I really think that's a critical aspect to understanding Palestine, understanding Israel, and understanding American interests in the region. And of course, all of this leads back to the question of oil. And thinking about the nature of oil and oil's position in global capitalism, because these Gulf states are really, they are the world's leading exporters of oil and gas, and they have since the Second World War really played this major role in shaping energy markets and therefore also the climate crisis today.
Yeah. So that's amazing. Let's I'm going to throw some things at you that are in my head that I've never been able to sort of do well. Maybe you could help me. One of the, it sounds like a silly question of just, how powerful is oil? It sounds like a silly one, but I've tried to run these thought experiments, and I've even tried to use like ChatGPT to help me like break it down a little bit at this point of like, in conceptual terms, how much of a massive sort of advance in sort of scientific efficiency of, goal-oriented behavior of humans. Like, I have 1,000, rows of corn that I need to harvest. And if it was just my manpower, I could do this much and it would cause me this much human labor. And if I had a wheelbarrow, I could maybe, do 2 rows. And if I had a steam power, I could do this. And then oil comes along and basically is such a massive game changer that it has shaped our world and our geopolitics in a way that still is difficult to describe. Did any of that just make sense, or can you do it better than me?
No, it makes total sense, and I guess I would. There would be 3 points I'd make around that. The first thing is really noting that this move to oil as the leading fossil fuel took place in around about the middle of the 20th century, around the time of the Second World War. And at that point, oil began to surpass coal as that leading fossil fuel. Now, that transition, that timing of that transition is really important, and I'm sure we'll come back to that in terms of how that connects to the Middle East and so forth in our discussion. So I guess that's the first thing, understanding that timing. The second thing, though, is really seeing that what oil did was way beyond its role as a liquid transport fuel. Now, this is a major thing, obviously. The fact that oil has a greater energy density than other kinds of fuels, the fact that it could be this liquid fuel firing internal combustion engines, so it revolutionized the whole kind of way the transport system worked globally, not just in terms of automobiles, but also in terms of shipping. The shift for navies away from coal-fired towards oil-fired ships that took place in the early 20th century was really a game changer for the way wars were waged. And this was a major actual part of, the British interests in the Middle East, which again, we can come back to that.
Yeah, we will.
So, that this question of oil as a fuel is very important, but oil also became embedded in our lives in ways that go unseen, I think, again, around this time of the middle of the 20th century. And that is through the petrochemical industry. Because what this did was oil became the commodity underlying all other forms of commodity production. So I'm talking here about plastics. I'm talking here about things like synthetic fertilizers, synthetic rubbers, all of these synthetic materials that are ultimately derived from oil. And really underlie everything around us. My clothes are made from oil. They're synthetic fabrics that are petrochemicals that are ultimately derived from oil. The rubber, the plastics that surround both of us in where we're sitting today are oil products. And one of the things one of the arguments I try to make in my book is that seeing oil in this ubiquitous way is very important because it's become invisibilized. We just think of oil as the thing we put in our car, as that liquid fuel, rather than actually seeing it as surrounding us and everything we do. And that was very important because what that did was it accentuated the power of oil companies because they became, in terms of refining and producing these petrochemicals, the substrate of everything. So, our food systems, our fashion systems, our industrial productions all became connected in this way to oil. So that's the second point I would say is that oil, really transformed everything. And it also became very important to the financial system, which again, I think we can come back to that question. And then the third point I would say is that when we think about transitions, energy transitions, we often think about, okay, we had coal and then along comes oil, coal gets, kicked out of the scene. But actually, that's not the case. Energy transitions are additive. They're not replacements. And this is true historically. So when oil did emerge as the principal fossil fuel, it certainly overtook coal. However, the production and consumption of coal kept on increasing. This year or last year, when we have the latest figures, was the largest consumption of coal and gas and oil in human history. So the curve isn't something that one replaces the other. It's actually additive. It adds on top. It's a continual growth, and I think that's a feature of capitalism as a social system, which is always pushing an increase in the energy throughput, and that's very important when we're thinking about the current or the so-called green transition. And the influx of renewable energy is that this is not about renewable energy, displacing fossil fuels. Unfortunately, it's about being added on to a fossil fuel substrate, and that's very important in thinking about the dynamics of this transition and the futures of the climate crisis.
Yeah, there's something depressing in that, I think. Well, let's circle back to some of those things you mentioned. And I guess let's first go to you mentioned British, but sort of Western colonial interest in the Gulf region. Is my history right that was oil discovered or found in Pennsylvania or Saudi Arabia? Am I getting that right or wrong? A little earlier than World War II, right?
Yes. I mean, the oil was the major oil producing regions of the world way before the Middle East were the United States, in various oil fields, Pennsylvania, Texas, and so forth, as well as Baku in Azerbaijan, and what becomes part of the Soviet Union. That was also a major oil producing region. This is before the Middle East entered on the scene as a major center of world oil.
So I guess before you get into it, let's tell me, I'm sort of curious your perspective of like the world wars and this intertwining or braiding story of oil and petrochemicals as a driver. I mean, who obviously the access to them, I think, determines who wins and loses a lot of those wars, which is interesting. But in what ways are so many of the conflicts that maybe we witness in the world and we hear rhetoric about democracy versus communism and all the other kind of isms that get laid on top of things, Islamism versus democracy and Israel, Palestine, you hear all these things, but underneath it all, how much do you kind of lean on the actually, you could probably pin a lot of this onto resource wars and sort of who has access to this stuff? Does that make sense? And even telling the world wars in a carving up the Middle East and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, all of it. How much is that about making sure you're the one who is at the end of the pipeline that you're going to build?
It's absolutely essential, and I think this is really part of thinking through why oil and why fossil fuels more generally became so embedded in our lives, and that was because of what it did for militarism and war making. We can rethink, and historians and other scholars have done so, rethink the First World War and the Second World War in light of these energy transitions. If we think, for example, what oil did to, there are figures looking at, say, the kind of armored vehicles, air war, aeroplanes, tanks, and this transition in navies away from coal-fired to oil-fired ships. All of this transformed war making, really amplified the destructiveness of war. Because it made they were so much more energy efficient. You could really fight in so many more different ways, and you can track the uptake of these kinds of new technologies of war that were ultimately oil-fired technologies through the First and Second World War. So I mentioned, for example, the Navy question, and that this is really important because, and it's explicitly said by Churchill. In the early, the second 1911, 1914, there are discussions going on in Britain about the need to transition the British Navy away from coal-fired ship to oil-fired ships because these were faster, they were cheaper to run, you required less manpower to actually run the energy sources on the ship. The refueling was much quicker for all of these different factors. And Churchill, who at that point was the head of the Admiralty in Britain, says very explicitly, we need to be, I'm paraphrasing here, we need to be the owners of oil that will fire these navies. And the key to this, actually, in the context of Britain's energy strategy was Iran. And at that point, Iran was basically under British control, and the oil extraction and the refining of oil, the biggest oil refinery in the world at the time was in Abadan, in Iran, present-day Iran, and it was British controlled. And the company that ran that was called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, and today we know that company is BP. So that's the early roots of BP, is in this kind of state-led attempt to gain control of oil. Now, the big oil producer globally in the early 20th century was the United States, and there we can see again. I go into some of these discussions in the book, is like looking at the discussions in the highest ranks of the US government about how to transform military and war making to oil, and really integrating at this point the big oil companies into the decision making around war in the US context. It's very interesting to see the ways that this kind of imbrication of oil and government and politics really becomes very clear in this moment of the earlier 20th century.
Yeah. My audience is probably tired of me pointing to it, but I've been talking about Mossadegh and the 1953 coup and the obvious role of the British, need or desire to keep the pipeline, which became BP, in their influence with the Shah. Let's then start talking about the Gulf states more in particular, and how, just sort of drawing a historical story here of the United States being the main oil producer, but when does the thinking sort of arise that, and you tell me because I'm ignorant here, maybe oil will peak in America, or it's getting harder to tap, or we're tapping it all, where more maybe global powers are deciding that the Middle East, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Iran, this is the deposit that really matters, about who controls this, and we need to make our play there. When does that thinking happen?
It's a very interesting history to try to map these shifts, because we see, I mentioned, the United States is the major center of oil, the oil economy, oil production in the early days of the 20th century. And at that stage, the Middle East was under European colonial domination, particularly
Right.
Britain and France. And US oil companies did not have a presence in the region really through the early days of the 20th century. After the First World War, they began to get somewhat of a foothold, but it was still European dominated. But then the big shift takes place after and during the Second World War.
Okay.
And this is where this timing of the coal to oil transition really becomes evident, because at that point, we see US post-war reconstruction in Europe really push forward the shift to oil away from coal. And we can see this in terms of fuel, but also in terms of the petrochemical industry. Because up until the Second World War, Europe's petrochemical industry, and remember these that we're talking here about kinds of, the oil products, plastics, and all these kinds of things, were coal-based. And this was headquartered in Germany, in Nazi Germany. And the chemical industry was integrated very closely with fascism in Germany. But the post-war period, the United States, as part of the Marshall Plan and the reconstruction of Western Europe, very consciously shifted the European energy system and petrochemical industry away from coal towards oil. Through the 50s and 60s. And the question, this is where the Middle East really comes in, because the oil that fueled, quite literally, this coal to oil transition in Western Europe came from the Middle East. It was Middle East oil. From the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia is becoming at this stage a major producer, but also Iran, as I mentioned, Iraq is important, and elsewhere. So you can see, I mean, the statistics are very striking here. If you look, for example, in terms of Europe's oil imports, in 1947, it was around about 43% of their imports came from the Middle East. By 1960, this had become over 85%. So it's really, this is oil from the Middle East. It's cheaper to produce and cheaper to transport to Europe. It's closer than the US. It also means that you're not drawing down on US oil supplies, because also at this time, the US oil economy is booming as well. So, the Marshall Plan, the biggest dollar spending in the Marshall Plan was for oil, but that was also explicitly stated that this oil was not to come from the United States. It came from the Middle East. And at this stage, we start to see a greater entry of US oil companies into the region, in particular into Saudi Arabia. Saudi Aramco, which is an American, at this stage, American oil firm, is formed, run by the big American oil companies. So we see this is where these shifts happen. We see the shift to oil as the dominant fossil fuel, but we also see in the Middle East the shift away from European colonial domination towards the US in that post-war period as the dominant external power in the region. And very much these energy and global power transitions are very much interlinked. That's really important, I think, in terms of understanding why fossil fuels became so central to our lives. What scientists call the great acceleration, the devastation of the climate and the biodiversity and so forth, really is dated from this post-war transition to oil.
Yeah, let's stay right here. This is perfect, because now I think you set it up beautifully of these links, and with still focus on the Middle East, and then your initial answer of why you got interested in these, that the intertwining of politics and other grievances and power plays here in the Gulf countries and its relation to America. So the story you just told, and I heard, again, I'm going to be a little obtuse here, I think, is, they're under colonial rule for quite a while, leading up to the world wars, and the world wars happen. And after the second one, there's this feeling that now a wave of kind of like decolonization, like this is finally going to stop, right? You get these movements all over Africa and in the Middle East and South America to be like, hey, that United Nation thing sounds great. We want to be there and we want to be our own nation. And these fights get very complicated. But tell me the story of how that plays out in the Middle East. Again, from my sort of really maybe elementary understanding, I would be like, well, if I was some Gulf country or citizen, I would be like, we've been under colonial rule for so long. We have this really valuable stuff under our feet. It's finally time for us to be a nation and, you know, sell it on the open market and build up our own economies. Again, I always use Mossadegh as the example for this. And then that idea and plan seems to have not worked out ideally for so many citizens in the Middle East, where you tell me what went wrong and what happened. And then I'm going to put one more thing on your plate as you reply. And I don't know if you're comfortable going there, but the story of Dhahran in Saudi Arabia and the bin Laden family, as far as I understand it, that had the entire contract to build the whole thing because they were contractors, is another and very obviously sort of explosive one story of just how much this matters, the interplay between oil and power and American sort of neo-colonialism, or whatever you'll term it, post-World War II, that becomes a massively important variable to consider and discuss in all of our lives over the next few decades. I know that was a lot to put on your plate, but if you can respond.
Yeah, absolutely. So this trend, you're absolutely right in pointing to this kind of wave of anti-colonial and national liberation struggles that's global in that post-war period. Of course, there's movements and struggles before the Second World War, but really in that wake of the Second World War, when Britain and France and the European colonial powers are really kind of staggering. As a result of the war, the US is emerging as the dominant global power at the time, and there's an advance of these anti-colonial struggles against Britain and French colonial rule in the Middle East, and this is part of what people describe as the Bandung moment, the big movement in Indonesia in 1955, the conference to look at kind of decolonization, national independence, non-alignment, etc. So in the Middle East, this is expressed most forcefully by the Arab nationalist movements at the time, in particular Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, who led a military coup against a British-backed monarch in 1952, overthrowing King Farouk who was backed by the British, and really kind of staking out these new economic development strategies, political strategies about bringing back sovereignty, control of Egypt's resources. But this resonates very deeply across the whole of the Middle East. It's not simply in Egypt. So we see Nasserist movements in all countries. Even in Saudi Arabia, within the ruling family, there's a Nasserist current in the ruling family. You pointed to the Mossadegh and the attempt to nationalize oil in Iran is a very important step here. That set back through this coup led by the Americans and the British that kind of overturns this nationalization of oil. But the question of control of resources is a big thing in all of these anti-colonial national liberation struggles. So I don't want to say it's not just Nasser. There's movements and different kinds of expressions of these all around the region. There's big communist movements, and socialist parties also agitating. But the slogan of controlling oil and resources is really prominent in all of this kind of agitation that's taking place in that post-war period. So we see this occurring. At the same time, Britain and France is losing grip. Their rule had basically been through monarchies, like King Farouk in Egypt, but we see also in the Gulf states, in Iran, you had the Pahlavi monarchy, and various kinds of kings that ruled on behalf of these colonial powers. What happens at this moment is that it's a very kind of interesting shift, and which is it's kind of culminates in 1960 with the formation of OPEC.
Yeah.
Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, which is an attempt by major oil-producing countries. At the head of this was Saudi Arabia. Venezuela is also involved. Iran is also involved to take control over the oil supplies, at least at the level of upstream extraction, at least at the level of crude oil. We can talk about kind of the stages of the oil process, which is important to this, but perhaps a little bit later. So OPEC is formed in 1960, partly as an expression of these anti-colonial struggles. But at the same time, we have to remember in the Gulf states, in particular in Saudi Arabia, we have this monarchical rule, an unpopular, very narrow layer of monarchies that are at the same time concerned about their own position.
Right.
They're worried about being overthrown by these anti-colonial struggles. And there's essentially a deal that's made between Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf monarchies, as well as at this time Iran, the Pahlavi monarchy, to ally themselves with, in particular, the United States, and to see their power guaranteed by the United States in return for allowing the flow of oil to continue into Western states and to avoid the use of oil as a kind of political weapon. So this kind of alliance between the United States and Saudi Arabia, and there's various parts of this which we can unpack, but this alliance kind of takes place in that post-war period, 1960s, and particularly the 1970s. So it means on one hand, upstream crude oil production is in the hands of these major oil producers now, like Saudi Arabia. But on the other hand, these major oil producers politically and economically become very embedded in the United States domination of the region at that time.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of big picture.
Yeah. We're going to get to obviously 73 and the OPEC crisis, and we're going to get to 67. But before those entirely, I want people to track, and I'm curious your thoughts in that period of Israel as one of the, I don't know if it counts as a Gulf state, but a nearby state, a neighboring state there, that fits into that picture in that equation in a very maybe strained or interesting way, especially pre-67. And I'm curious how you would characterize from 47, of course, with the partition and then the war till 67, Israel's simmering issue in this region, and maybe their relation and how the monarchies and the elites who may have been angling for this kind of very tight protectionist deal for them and their families with Western powers, and then this little thing called Israel that's kind of growing on the horizon as a potential problem, which of course Nasser was quite animated about the Palestinian cause. So in your entire story there, which is great, the Palestinians, I think people could appreciate, got kind of steamrolled by a lot of giant forces. And we all know that the grievances started to build and they felt abandoned and never taken care of. But how would you, just before we get to 67, where I think a lot of these dynamics really changed, how would you talk about Israel in that 47 to 67 period in the story you just told?
Israel really, Israel's formed as a state in 1948, and it's based on the expulsion of 70 to 80% of the Palestinian population in the territory at the time. Most of those become refugees in neighboring Arab countries, in Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and elsewhere. And at this stage,
that was your family history as well. Just was in that story you just told. Okay,
yes, my father was one of the refugees from 48.
Gotcha.
But trying to see at this point, basically between 48 up until 67 or so, the major kind of power backer of Israel were Britain in particular and France as the kind of major allies of Israel. And this goes back into the early 20th century with this kind of support of Britain to the Zionist movement, really kind of explicitly seeing the creation of this state as a potential ally, Western ally, in the region. Now, so this is at this stage, remember these dynamics are occurring as oil is also becoming increasingly significant to the global economy. The Gulf states and Saudi Arabia in particular are becoming increasingly significant oil producers and exporters. And there's these dynamics of the anti-colonial upsurge, in particular Nasser in Egypt. So what we see here, one thing Nasser does that's very significant, for example, in 1956, shortly after the 1952 coup, is he nationalizes the Suez Canal, which was a major transport route for oil globally, and brings that under Egyptian control. It was previously under Britain and French control. So what we see happening basically through that period and culminating, 1967 is the key date here, because in 1967 there's a war and Israel basically defeats the Egypt, Syria, the Arab nationalist movement, Nasserism, politically is set back and defeated. And at that moment, that's when the United States steps in and becomes the major foreign patron of Israel, because it sees very clearly the utility of Israel in this sense of beating back the kind of national liberation, anti-colonial struggles in the region. 1967 is kind of a key turning point. So that's when the shift moves away from kind of British, French towards the United States as the dominant backer of Israel. So in this moment, we see two major pillars of American power post 67. On one side, Israel; on one side, the Gulf monarchies. Iran was important here as well up until 1979, but then in 1979 the Pahlavi monarchy is overthrown in the Iranian Revolution, and that kind of breaks away from that American alliance. But the two main pillars become Israel and the Gulf states.
This is great. So now I'm curious, from 67, and I want to get to 73 and the OPEC oil embargo. How do you get us from 67 to 73? Politically and economically. And then I also just have questions. I know I keep giving you two, but I have questions about, I get the logic of these monarchies and these very small elites that America, basically the deal is, we'll protect you. We'll give you all the military might you need to suppress any kind of trouble on the horizon in your backyard, as long as you just keep, pumping the oil in our direction. And we're soon going to get to the petrodollar system, which was another deal. How do they do it? They seem so outnumbered. How can they suppress these movements from growing and from taking over? Although perhaps maybe Iran was the one that did get away, and that's what we saw, and it had a very Islamic flavor. So I know I gave you two questions there, but 67 to 73, and how are they able to exert this control?
Well, they're two very much connected questions. It's really, really important when we're thinking about oil, and this is, again, a point I really try to make in my book, is that thinking about oil not just as an underground reserve, what we call the upstream, that's called the upstream of the oil industry, that's the crude reserves under the ground, but to think about how oil moves to the consumer. Whether it be in the form of your petrol tank or the petrochemical products, the fertilizers, the pen, our clothes. We need to think about oil as it's extracted, but then as it's moved, as it's refined, as it's turned into useful products, how it's shipped around the world. And that's called the downstream. So there's two aspects to the oil industry, upstream and the downstream. Now, up until for most of the 20th century, those two aspects were controlled by Western oil companies. And there were 7 of them in for most of this history, called they were called the Seven Sisters. And these are companies that today we know as ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, Chevron. There were these big 7 Western companies. They were European and American companies. And they controlled that whole chain from the upstream to the downstream, globally, including in the Middle East, for much of the history of the region. Now, and they also controlled the pricing of oil. They basically set what the price of crude oil was going to be. And they paid like a small rent or royalty to the producer governments in places like Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or wherever it might be. So a lot of the struggle between those producer governments and the oil companies was how much that rent was going to be, and the kind of price on which it was based. So this is important because when OPEC was formed, and then slowly as oil was nationalized in the 60s and 70s, what came under the control of the producer governments was the upstream segment, not the downstream. So it was the Western companies that continued to ship oil around the world. They controlled the tanker fleets. They controlled the refineries. They're the ones who ran the petrol stations and delivered the products to you as a consumer. So that downstream remained under Western control up until this is called vertical integration, the kind of control from the upstream through to the downstream, really remained under Western control up until the 1990s, and much more recently, which we can talk about later, is when some of these big producer governments began and have really taken big steps into the downstream sector. So that's kind of how the oil industry looked from that 67 to 73 period. So even though we have OPEC, we have the nationalization of oil, it's still Western oil companies that are setting the price of oil and also controlling the kind of circulation of oil globally at the time. So the political question is really we see in this period the kind of setbacks to the kind of radical and Arab nationalist movements that were launched through the 67 war. We see different struggles occurring in Yemen, in Dhofar, and other, Iraq, in Palestine. But there's really counter-revolutionary attacks against these kinds of different struggles. And the US and Britain are playing a major role in that. Iran, under the Pahlavi monarchy, is also playing a major role in these counter-revolutionary efforts. This is kind of where we see this alliance between the US and the Gulf states really and the US, domination of the region really kind of taking shape through that period. So, that's the kind of the political map overlaid on the kind of changes to the oil industry that's beginning to occur in this period.
Yeah. And so then take me to, well, I guess also, am I right to think that this was also the period of, I'm trying to have you sort of psychoanalyze America's relationship with Israel, since this is just an interest of mine, where they figured out, because for like the layman, they might think this all sounds kind of great, but isn't the whole region really animated and angry about this one? If there's this anti-colonial, anti-American kind of pulse in the region that feels a little unsatisfied with their post-World War II trajectories, this Israel project is such a thorn in their side and like a stick in their eye that feels like a Western imperial project, let alone sort of the treatment of the Palestinians. That this is like, for American oil interests, this is a problem. They would be like, why are you supporting Israel? It's just pissing off all of these oil-rich nations that you want good rent from, right? So from a sort of realpolitik perspective, you would be like, this is just causing a massive problem. But is there another motive there where they somehow, I don't know, figured out, as maybe Henry Kissinger or whatever, sort of controlled chaos kind of relationship in theory with the region, that is they learned how, I think as RFK said, to make Israel the their battleship in the Middle East to kind of ensure this system goes. I don't know how stable it is, but is that fair before we get to 73 and OPEC? It always feels like sort of a clash of sort of pure strategic thinking that America would support Israel, because isn't it causing so many problems for them there? Does that,
Well, I think it's actually not, in the sense that Israel really is playing that role. And it exemplified that in 1967 in terms of its ability to really act in the interests of the US and other Western states in the region at that time and post 67, as I've said. So, this kind of, we see, for example, in Egypt at this moment, Nasser is there in 67, but he dies soon after. We see then coming into power Anwar Sadat, and then later Hosni Mubarak, and these different successive military, they're all drawn from the Egyptian military, actually start to normalize their relations with Israel, again under American auspices. So there's peace agreements between Egypt and Israel, similarly with Jordan and Israel, and so that's I think kind of the role that Israel comes to play at that moment really is very clear. And there are you can look at, for example, Alexander Haig, who made this statement. He was Secretary of State under Reagan. Made that statement. Israel is the again paraphrasing is an aircraft carrier that carries no American soldiers. Joe Biden said something similar in the early 80s, where he said, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to create it. It's the best investment we can make. This kind of strategic utility of Israel becomes very clear, and in many ways it's akin to the role that South African apartheid played in the African continent. Again, backed by the Americans and the British through the 60s, 70s, and all the way up to the fall of the apartheid regime in 1994. I mean, that kind of outpost, which is dependent upon external support. Israel becomes the major recipient of US military and financial aid globally throughout this period, and it continues through today in that respect. But again, in terms of thinking about it, we need also to contextualize this in terms of the way the oil industry looks, and the fact that it may be true crude reserves in the Gulf and other areas are coming under the control of the governments of those regions, but the downstream sector is still under the control of Western oil companies. It begins to get broadened a little bit in the 60s and 70s, away from just those 7 companies, but it's still Western oil companies in general that control the structure of the industry as a whole.
Okay, so take me to 73. I wasn't alive yet. I didn't live through this crisis, but it looks crazy in the photos, and I think maybe it was a massive shock to the world. But take, I guess, the Nixon shock, and then 73, the OPEC crisis, and then the petrodollar as a system which emerged from it, which I'm not sure if I'm making too much of in my mind, but I'd love for you to explain it to me, because when I again, I'm not an economist and I'm sort of a novice but when I learn the petrodollar system, it feels like the greatest scam that America ever pulled off, but I might just be overstating it, or that it's a massively powerful weapon that doesn't sort of get talked about. I have no idea the current state of it, but it seems, so just take me through that. I think I probably make too much of it, but maybe not.
I mean, I don't think you're making too much. I think it is really critical aspect of understanding oil. And again, to come back to this point that oil is not simply the black sticky glue that's the goo that's under the ground. We really need to trace what oil becomes. And one of the things it becomes is oil wealth. And where that wealth goes is really important to understanding oil's place in our lives and in the global economy. So, we said, there's this 1967 OPEC is formed. There's a slow nationalization of oil through the 70s globally, but also in the Middle East. And one of the things this does is that it really lessens the control of Western oil companies on the upstream part of the oil industry and lessens their ability to set the price of oil. And that's what happens in the 1973 crisis, basically. The OPEC, OPEC countries say we are going to take control over that pricing. It's no longer going to be in the hands of Western oil companies, and that leads to a big spike in the price of oil globally. And as part of that, it means that oil producing countries start to accumulate large amounts of dollars, and these are what we call petrodollars. Oil that's exported, sold for dollars, and then ends up in the hands of the oil producing states. So we're talking one figure I have is I think it's 1.4 trillion dollars that it accumulates in Middle East OPEC exporters alone, between I think 73 and 85 or something like that. Most of that, about 40% of that, is going to Saudi Arabia. So we can see we're talking about trillions of dollars in this first kind of 1970 period when the prices rise. Now, to come back to the question of the embargo and the boycott. So the first thing to say is this was not an OPEC embargo. There's kind of a myth out there that the OPEC states cut the supply of oil to Western markets. That was not the case. It was some Arab members of OPEC that were involved in that, and the targets were the US and the Netherlands in particular. The Netherlands at the time is the major kind of oil transit route into Western Europe, historically due to Shell, major role in the global oil company as one of the Seven Sisters. So this happens in we have the 73 this 73 embargo, and this comes back to this point of thinking about oil in the whole of the oil circuit. It really is, in my opinion, much more of a performative act that we see this embargo, in the sense that because Western firms still controlled everything from the transport to the final sale and the refining and all of that, they were able to kind of shift oil globally around and make sure it got to these Western markets, the US, and so there weren't really oil shortages in that kind of way. They also controlled the refining of oil products, and they did what you would expect a big oil company to do. They raised the prices of petrol and everything else. So this was actually extremely beneficial for these big Western oil companies because it enabled them. They accumulated a lot of money through the sale of these kind of inflated oil products as part of this embargo. So it was a short-lived thing. It allowed Saudi Arabia and these other states to say, look, we stand on the side of Palestine. But in reality, it was much more performative in what it intended to do. And then when these, through the 70s, as Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf monarchies started to accumulate these trillions of dollars in petrodollars, where did that money go? This is really the key question. And this comes to the point of what is the petrodollar system. So now, thinking back to that moment, we have the oil price spikes in the 70s. If you are a non-oil producing country, which most of the global south at that time didn't have their own oil resources, you're faced with like escalating oil bills for your imports. This is a moment of global downturn, so your country's exports are also, starting to fall globally. You need to borrow money. if you're a country like Egypt or wherever it might be, a non-oil producing country. And where do you get that money from? You get that money from, and this is what happened in the 70s, Western banks, Anglo-American banks. And those Anglo-American banks essentially lent out petrodollars that were deposited in their banks by the major oil producing states. So we see at this stage, this is kind of one of the key roots or underlying factors in the third world debt crisis that then later happens in the 80s. These countries become heavily indebted to Western banks through this process. So that's one thing that happens to these petrodollars is they recirculate through Western banks to non-oil producing countries and become bound up in this debt crisis that emerges later. Yeah. The other route that happens where these petrodollars go through the 70s in particular is they get deposited or they get Saudi Arabia and other places use them to buy US financial instruments like treasury bonds. And there's, negotiations between the US and Saudi Arabia about kind of these agreements that money would be recycled into US financial markets through the purchase of treasury bonds, investments in US equities, and so forth. So the money recirculates back into US financial markets. And this really is part of why, the system that we face today of like global debt or global lending from surplus countries into US Treasury debt is, has its origins at this moment of the 70s. And then the other really, really important route is through the purchase of military hardware. And so again, the Gulf becomes the major consumer of American-made military equipment through the 70s, and this continues through to today. We can talk about the current moment perhaps in a bit later, but these kind of routes of through. So the global financial architecture which we live in today, which is a US dollar-centered financial architecture, dominated by Anglo-American banks through like the City of London, through New York, etc., really is bound up with where these petrodollars went in the 70s. And this it's a complicated story, but it's very important to understand. The other side to this, which is really important to also point out here, is that in around about 1974-75, Saudi, and this is indicative of this kind of US-Saudi alliance, Saudi Arabia says, or basically says, OPEC will only price oil in US dollars. Okay? Up until that moment, about 20% of oil was sold in British sterling. And this is historic legacy of kind of Britain's role in European in colonialism in the Middle East and places like Iran, etc. About 20% of oil was sold in sterling. From that moment, the mid-1970s, oil is only sold in US dollars. And what does that mean? Remember, this is the moment of the big shift to oil as the most important commodity in the world. It means every country has to accumulate dollars in order to be able to buy the world's most important commodity. So it's really a central part of how the US dollar becomes the international reserve currency. Again, we're living with the consequences of that today. So this story, it's there's a lot of moving parts here, but the point being that oil is not just a physical commodity, it's also a financial source of financial wealth, and tracking where that wealth goes is critical to understanding the importance of oil today.
Yeah, no, that was really good. It is complicated. I'm gonna, if you wouldn't mind doing me a favor, when this is done, I want to send you a short animation I found on YouTube that explains the petrodollar. But before I recommend it to my audience, I want your blessing on it. I think it's really good, and it's one of these like chalkboard drawings. But I was like, and that's where I started overestimating it. But I want your blessing, and shoot me an email back, and I'll tell them Adam Hanieh says thumbs up or thumbs down or what's wrong with it. That'd be awesome. Okay, so that was fantastically good. I want to get to with our remaining time. I want to get to the resource politics of Palestine now, today, and what you think has changed. Because we've brought this up through the 70s now, and then we're entering the 80s, where we have the First Intifada and the Second Intifada happening in Israel. This lingering problem in your entire story is the Palestinians are still just waiting for an answer, and that answer never comes, and it flares up every now and then. So I guess if you can bring me through the 80s and into today, and obviously it's when a consciousness of climate change also starts to appear and become a conversation. So take me up to today, where we left off.
Yes. So there's this system of, if we start again with the kind of the structure of the world oil industry, it begins to move away from this kind of Western-centered industry in the 70s and 80s, as we see the upstream control moving into the hands of the producer countries, but the downstream remaining mostly Western centered. But then and the pricing system changes, as I described. So now the price is no longer controlled by the big Western producers. But what happens really, a critical shift begins in the 90s and early 2000s with the emergence of China. As a major center of global manufacturing. It's opening up to the world. All of this foreign direct investment is coming into China. And we see this kind of industrialization, which everyone is, I'm sure, familiar with. Now, what did that require? It required energy. China's growth required huge quantities of energy, in particular oil and gas, natural gas. Where China itself is a major oil producer. It has, I think, something like 6th or 7th biggest oil producer in the world. But that domestic oil wasn't enough to meet its energy needs. So it needed enormous quantities of imports. So basically what we see through the first decades of the 2000s is a shift in the world oil trade, and in particular in the nature of the Gulf's oil exports. Up until then, most of the Gulf's exports went to Western markets, Western Europe and to North America. From the 2000s onward, these began to shift eastward. And now the vast bulk of the Gulf's exports of oil go to China and wider East Asia.
And one question on that, because of the petrodollar arrangement or system or agreement or whatever, that also needs to be sold in dollars, or it's priced in dollars. Is that true?
It's still priced in dollars. Yes, it's still priced in dollars. The oil industry as a whole is still dollar denominated.
Right.
There is talk, obviously, of being able
BRICS
to sell in yuan and BRICS and stuff, but at the moment it's still dollar denominated.
And I just want to underline that point before you go on. Again, maybe I make too much of the petrodollar thing, but when you, again, like someone who doesn't study it as closely as I do, or as you do, and you're looking into the Iraq War and you notice Saddam Hussein, obviously tensions were rising for a lot of reasons, but then says, hey, I want to sell my oil in euro. And then the next day there's a war, you start, scratching your head a little bit. Or in Libya, regardless of what we want to say about Gaddafi, he started floating this idea of a gold dinar to trade their oil in their own currency. And suddenly, he's a goner. It's like for the outsider looking in, maybe again, that's why I put too much on this, the intertwined, and you've done so well with it, the intertwined relationship of currency and financial power and oil begins to make you a little crazy.
I wouldn't say the reason for these wars are they're much more complicated.
Right.
But this question, it is very clear that the US is attempting to prevent any shift away from dollar-denominated oil. But maybe I'll come back to that because there's
I derailed you. We were talking
to
China. Yeah, absolutely.
No. It relates very much to that this point. So we see this eastward shift, and basically this does two things. One thing it does is it leads to a massive increase in the global oil consumption. Because it wasn't a zero-sum game. It wasn't as if China increased its consumption and the rest of the world fell. The whole world went up, and China really led that global growth. So this is another reason why there's been such a huge increase in fossil fuel consumption over the last 30 years is related to this. Obviously directly implicated to the climate emergency. The second thing that it did, China's rise, is that it shifted the world's oil exports eastward. China now consumes about 20% of the world's oil imports. So this is up from about 6% in 2000. So it's about the equivalent of a new US entering the world oil market in terms of the oil trade. So it's really led to this dramatic shift. And most of China's oil imports come from the Gulf and also Iraq. That's where the bulk of it comes from. So we see this kind of east-east interdependencies, is how I describe it in the book, is between the Gulf and China, East Asia. Now, the interesting thing about this is that it's also been accompanied by the kind of downstream diversification of the big Gulf oil companies. So these companies are no longer simply upstream extractors. They now control shipping routes. They're major petrochemical producers. The second biggest synthetic rubber producer in the world is owned by Saudi Aramco. Saudi Aramco is by far the largest oil company in the world today. Its profits last year exceeded the combined profits of the large five Western companies, ExxonMobil, Shell, Total Energies, BP, and Chevron. Collectively, though, their profits of the Western firms was exceeded by Aramco. So basically they followed the route that the seven sisters and the big Western companies in the early 20th century did in this downstream, all the way down the oil value chain. And most of this is now connected to the Chinese consumption and wider East Asia consumption. So they're not simply crude oil producers. They're involved in refining, tanker fleets, marketing, petrochemical refining, all that kind of thing. Now, so that's very important because what it means is that those kind of interdependencies are quite deep. However, and this is really a key point to emphasize, is that the petrodollars that the Gulf continues to accumulate, and there's been a new petrodollar boom over the last 20 years because of this growth in Chinese demand. Those many trillions of dollars is accumulating in the Gulf in various ways, sovereign wealth funds and other kinds of investment vehicles. Most of that is still going to the United States. Okay, there's increasing levels into East Asia and into the wider Middle East region, but proportionally, the bulk of it is still going to U.S. financial markets. So if we look, for example, at the Gulf's investments in U.S. equities, you can look on the U.S. Treasury website, and they break it down, who are the foreign investors in U.S. equities or U.S. stock markets. The Gulf has about 5% of all foreign investment in U.S. stock markets. This has tripled since 2017. It's one of the leading investors in U.S. Stock markets. Again, to come back to the arms trade, which remains another way in which these petrodollars recircle into U.S. markets, about a fifth of the world's arms exports went to the Gulf between 2019 and 2023. It was more than any other region of the world. And most of this comes from the US. It's US arms manufacturers, military companies, military hardware manufacturers that are selling to the Gulf. So, these kinds of linkages that we saw established in the 70s remain extremely pertinent today. The US is the largest recipient of US arms between 2020 and 2024. And what does this mean? It provides profits for US arms manufacturers, but it also embeds this relationship between the US and the Gulf ever more solidly. So it's contradictory. On one side, we see this kind of diversification in trade relations, and the export of oil and also gas is important here. The Gulf is the second largest exporter of natural gas or liquefied natural gas to China after Australia, which is extremely important as well. But the petrodollar system still embeds the Gulf in the US financial markets in very clear ways.
Yeah, it sounds crazy. The story that you lay out, I mean, it confirms a lot of my fears in some ways. But I was talking to someone like Scott Horton, who's a hardcore libertarian, and we connected a lot of his anger about Israel and what's happening there. Particularly as a libertarian, he thinks he wants America out of all foreign entanglements, period, like George Washington style, right? And the one piece of the puzzle I was having a difficult time putting on the table, maybe because it's so complex, is a lot of you're describing a detailed, entangled world where I was trying to say, America does benefit. I think it's immoral, right? But does benefit from the chaos in the world and the system that is feeding the fiat currency and the inflationary currency in America in such a way, and the dollar, to prevent maybe hyperinflation or something like that. But I was unsuccessful getting it kind of on the table for him in this way. Does that question make sense of in what way is, not just Israel, but a lot of this chaos, in what way is the liberation? If I'm saying genuine liberation in something like Saudi Arabia is overthrowing the monarchy and having a sort of more egalitarian society with more control and sovereignty over your own resources and the ability, God forbid, to sell it in your own currency and reinvest it in your own people, that if that happens, the system you just described completely collapses for America, and they've got all the weapons, right? So it's is my frustration coming across the screen in any way that you could respond to? Yeah.
I definitely think, and this is why putting this history in a longue durée is so important. And the 1970s is really the moment where this kind of structure, and it is very complicated, but its kind of essential elements remain in place today through all of these different routes of petrodollar flows and oil exports, etc. One other important thing to throw into the mix here is the Gulf sovereign wealth funds, which have grown enormously. So these are state-run or state-owned investment vehicles that kind of part of the wealth from oil and gas exports are put in these vehicles, and they invest around the world. And we're talking here, I think the latest figure is over $5 trillion held by the major Gulf sovereign wealth funds alone. 6 out of the 10 largest SWFs are Gulf owned. So we're talking, again, it's about 40% of global sovereign wealth fund wealth is in the Gulf. So where that wealth is deployed is very important. And we saw this in Trump's visit to the region a few months ago, earlier this year, when he visited Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the UAE. A big part of the discussion was what's going to happen with this sovereign wealth fund money. And the Gulf states were very open about investing it into the US. So, it's not, I'm not trying to say, it's only the Gulf. Obviously, this is part of a bigger global political economy, but we need to think about the way the Gulf is like part of how the contemporary financial system emerged, and in particular, the way that the US centered financial system is able to reproduce and maintain itself.
Yeah.
And a really important factor in all of this is the power of the US dollar, what this gives the United States in terms of power of sanctions and the power to exclude other states from the financial system. When we're thinking about the US dollar, it's not just a question of, surpluses and deficits and where this money goes. The US dollar, by virtue of its characteristic as, the international reserve currency, if the US prevents other countries from accessing US dollars or be entering into relationships with US banks, it's a big source of US power.
Yeah.
It's not just military and political power the US holds, it's financial power through this threat of sanctions. So I think that's part of it, this calculation as well. But if we're thinking more speculatively into the future, in the event of any kind of sharper crisis between the United States and China, or further erosion of US power globally, this connection with the Gulf and also with Israel really becomes central. Because you could imagine a scenario where there is a war or a deeper conflict where the US leans on the Gulf around kind of exports of oil, for example, to China, or if there is sanctions and China can't import oil in a different currency, it's going to play into what happens. So, these kinds of questions, I think, are really bound up with how the US is viewing this alliance with the Gulf and the wider Middle East region in the current moment.
Am I wrong to think that a lot of what you said also seems pretty hopeless or disincentivizes solving the climate change or getting off oil? It seems is that am I hearing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is another very important point to kind of highlight is that alongside this shift of the big Gulf oil companies into these diversified, vertically integrated firms, the biggest firms in the world in many cases, these are national oil companies like Aramco, like Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. They have also taken a major place in climate policy making, climate negotiations. We saw this with the COP summit that happened in Dubai a couple of years ago. That was run by the CEO of ADNOC, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. There's many other examples we could talk about where it's the Gulf states that are setting the tenor and the tone and the trajectory of the climate emergency. And in disastrous ways. We last few weeks there's been negotiations around the plastics treaty. Trying to reduce and limit the production of plastics. The reason that treaty failed was because of largely the outside place of companies like Aramco in this treaty negotiations. That's something we need to recognize. All of the big Gulf producers have projected ramping up the production of oil and gas in large and substantial ways over the next 5 to 10 years. The Saudi oil minister said in 2021, every molecule of hydrocarbon will come out. So there is no intent by any of these states to reduce the production of fossil fuels. Having said that, they are at the same time really moving into renewable energy as well. And this comes back to the point I was making earlier about kind of the additive nature of energy production. You look at something like 50% of the Middle East renewable capacity now is in the Gulf region. And this has really happened in the last 5 to 6 years. And there's various reasons for this, but one of the reasons is that the Gulf states are major consumers of electricity, and most of this electricity is fossil fuel-based production, oil and gas. And what they want to do is shift some of that electricity consumption into solar and wind, thereby freeing up more oil and gas for export.
Yeah.
So, this and this also dovetails with their role in the climate kind of trajectory, negotiations and policy making. So, this is a call to say when we're thinking about the climate emergency, we need to put front and center not just the big Western oil companies like ExxonMobil, who absolutely bear culpability and need to be on the radar, but also consider strategically the place of the Gulf oil producers, because they have a seat at the table because of their connection to the Gulf states and places like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. They're in the room when these negotiations are being decided upon and voted upon, and they're the ones that are blocking them, even though it spells certain collapse if they're successful in doing so.
Wow. So very last one, then I just want you to respond to the world we're in. I think if you're seeing a coalescence of a lot of social strife, obviously the Palestine cause has animated so many people, I think for moral reasons, but I think many of us think or can see that it ties into so many of these larger political tensions. And how are you reading what's happening there globally? It seems like the climate justice, Palestine cause, maybe global capitalism frustrations is all coalescing into something that people feel a kind of a tremors of an earthquake under our feet. How are you reading what's going to happen and at the moment? Or if you could even just respond to sort of, as a Palestinian, the sort of moral horror on your screen and how it aligns with these bigger geopolitical things that you spend your time thinking about.
I mean, I think absolutely we need to see the question of Palestine and the genocide in Gaza as very much related to these dynamics around the climate and our fossil fuel-centered world. As I've really tried to emphasize, we can't understand Palestine separate from its place in the broader region, separate from the emergence of the Middle East and the Gulf in particular as kind of the key linchpin of the world oil trade and that coal to oil transition and all the ways that's changed now with the rise of China. It's connected not just to the export of crude oil, it's connected to plastics, petrochemicals, financial wealth, and thinking about the region, therefore, thinking about Palestine through the lens of the region is really key, because what it does is it makes Palestine a climate issue. We hear a lot about ecocide in Gaza today, which is absolutely true. The destruction of the infrastructure and electricity and sanitary, all of that is very true. We hear a lot also about the gas fields off the coast of Gaza and the wider Mediterranean, and the ways that play into Israeli intentions and strategy in Gaza. That's true. But ultimately, what makes Palestine a climate issue is because of its centrality in the kind of the region's centrality in the global fossil fuel economy. And that's really, really important to foreground. And that's why I think climate activists really need to see the struggle for like a broader climate justice as connected to the struggle for Palestine liberation. So I think that's one of the things we can see over the last 2 to 3 years is the way in which this kind of, I think, awareness around these things have become much more generalized among the global population. It's not just a moral outrage about the horrors we see in Gaza, but it is a sense in which this is being viewed much more through through the lens of the questions of climate, the questions of global economy, and the geopolitical and authoritarian turn we see in the US and Europe and elsewhere. So I think these things are like very much interconnected, but spelling out the mechanics and the actual connections in detail is the challenge that we face.
Yeah, that was beautiful. Well, thank you. That was really awesome, really informative, and
Thank you, Jay.
also totally random. But I always choose a different record behind me that might connect to the speaker I'm speaking with. There's a band called the China Crisis, and I think you literally said China Crisis. They were like a bad 80s new wave band. So bingo for you.
Perfect.
Anyway, this was great. Thanks so much. So that video that I mentioned that I was going to send him, this animation on YouTube, I did get Adam's reply, and I'm happy to so he said this petrodollar video is good and clear explanation of how the system works and how it originated. I'm more skeptical of a shift towards oil pricing in yuan or other currencies, and we also need to recognize that China, Japan, and other surplus countries continue to invest in U.S. treasuries and other financial securities, so the system is bigger than oil. But overall, a clear outline. Very cool. So got the thumbs up, it sounds like, this video. So do go watch this video. His entire channel is really awesome with these like whiteboard style animations that are kind of funny, that explain a lot of economics. But watch that video on the petrodollar. I'll put it in the link as well. And then again, if you made it this far, you're probably a fan. So if you're interested, sign up for the membership program to Dilemma, and we'll do a live stream together, members only, last Sunday of every month. I'll do it at 12 p.m. Eastern time on a Sunday. And then also, I'm going to be up at the How the Light Gets In festival in London. That is on September 20th and 21st. I'm hosting 3 panels, which should be really fun, really cool, interesting topics. So if you happen to be in London on those days at the How the Light Gets In festival, you could come say hi to me. And then in the meantime, I have about 8 interviews that are booked and lined up with some amazing guests like Paul Jay and Marcus Sawyer, and who else am I talking to? Nandita Sharma, and incredible people. So see you soon, and thanks again, everyone, for your support.